Tonight on Nation to Nation, Greyhound buses have stopped rolling in Western Canada, and remote First Nations will be hit the hardest. Yet the federal government announced plans to help out just yesterday.
The Liberal government knew about this problem months ago, and yet they were slow on acting.
And the Auditor General slammed a skills and training program. It's supposed to help Indigenous people get high-paying jobs, but there's no data to say if it's working.
This will be a crisis in our country, no question about it. It is right now. It's going to be more so as we develop the North.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Today is truly the end of an era. Throughout most of the prairies, you can no longer hop on a Greyhound bus to get where you're going. For rural Canada and remote Indigenous communities, the buses had been transportation lifelines. The federal government did announce yesterday a plan to fund bus line gaps. In particular, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott said there's new funding in the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program for anyone who wants to start up a transportation company. This is what she had to say.
This is available to any Indigenous entrepreneurs who are interested in having support for starting up a business, for getting the appropriate business plan in place, marketing their new business, and it's something that we are certainly hopeful that there will be many First Nations, Inuit and Métis business people who may use this opportunity.
Join me now to discuss the disappearance of Greyhound on the prairies is our panel of MPs. To my immediate right is Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Services, Dan Vandel.
Morning.
Kevin Wong, Conservative MP from Saskatchewan.
Thanks, Todd.
And Georgina Jollybaugh, NDP MP, also from Saskatchewan. Welcome to Nation to Nation. Ms. Jollybaugh, on this issue, I'm going to start with you. You hail from northern Saskatchewan, of course. I've heard that Indigenous people actually rely on the Greyhound bus less and less now. How is this going to hurt them?
Well, first of all, the Saskatchewan Party, when they cut the STC, it really impacted northern Saskatchewan, the rural municipalities, and reserves across throughout the whole north, people getting to Saskatoon, and so they were already struggling. And people yesterday and the day before on CBC News, the Manitoba woman out of Sprague, that happens to be my auntie, and she is a regular user of Greyhound from where she is to visit her kids in Red Deer. I do know that many Indigenous people across Canada had used Greyhound regularly and consistently, and now it's really devastating for Canada.
Of course, the government did announce a plan yesterday morning. Mr. Waugh, government's plan is going to try and involve the private sector. Isn't that a good thing, especially from a Conservative point of view?
Oh, I think it's a very good thing, Todd. The only thing I would say to that, though, Greyhound announced months ago they were going to pull service. So here it is on the 18th hour, on the 31st of October, the last day for Greyhound, they roll out their plan. There has been, in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and some Alberta, you know, we've seen some companies already come forth and try to fill the gaps. All the gaps are not filled. I would agree with Georgina. All the gaps are not filled, but they're trying to fill some of the gaps, and I'll give you one. There's a company out of Prince Albert now that has a van that goes from Saskatoon to Edmonton for $80 one way. That's very economical. And so they're trying to fill that. There's others in Regina, there's Winnipeg, but I think where we have the issue with Indigenous population, it's the far north, you know, of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. The ridership is not there, and of course, you're talking maybe 3 or 4 people on that system, and it's just not economical.
Mr. Vandel, talking about economics, your minister told me or announced yesterday that there's an Aboriginal entrepreneurship fund that people can tap into. But how can they make a go of it when a business like Greyhound couldn't do it?
Well, first of all, let me say that our government recognizes that Greyhound's decision last July really caused much hardship for Indigenous people, certainly for vulnerable people, including Indigenous women and girls, for people that live in remote communities, and we fully understand that. We launched 3 ministers yesterday, or Minister Philpott, Minister Garneau, and Minister LeBlanc launched a 3-prong approach. Number 1, we are working with provinces to try to to try to find viable operators to fill those gaps that Kevin referred to, the routes that have not yet been filled. The good news is 87% of the routes that were vacated by Greyhound are now being replaced by private operators. We are going to work with provinces to try to find viable operations for the final 13% of those routes. And you're absolutely right. It's not going to be easy, but we're committed to that. Under the Indigenous Services portfolio, we found a dedicated funding stream for under the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program to try to find viable Indigenous businesses, to transportation businesses to fill, also work to fill in those the last 13%. And the last point of our plan is that looking more long term. We're involving the provinces, the territories, Indigenous nations, the private sector, to try to solve precisely what you've identified. We need a long-term national ground transportation strategy, and we're looking at all the alternatives for that to see if that indeed is viable. Keeping in mind, Todd, that since 1954, this has been the responsibility of provinces in Canada. It's something they negotiated quite hard to get responsibility for. That's still the reality in Canada. And as part of the important principles of that, it would be led by market forces and competition. So all of that is the reality that we're working with, but our priority certainly is to fill in the last 13% of the routes that are still vacant.
Does that mean that the federal government may have to step in and actually subsidize these routes at some future date?
Well, we're looking at all alternatives right now with the long-term working group. We know it's the responsibility of provinces. We hope that all the provinces are willing to try to be a part of the solution in this. I agree with the other members here that this is something that's going to especially hit Indigenous populations and remote populations, and we need a way for our citizens to travel from city to city, province to province.
Mr. Waugh, as a Saskatchewan politician, how concerned are you that the service that replaces Greyhound may not be up to the same standards?
Well, I think we're going to see some pressures on this because we got the carbon tax that's being enforced on January 1st on our province of Saskatchewan, so the cost is obviously going to go up. The one thing we haven't talked about with Greyhound and these individual owners now that are coming forward to do entrepreneurship, you know, yes, people are one thing, but freight is the other. That Greyhound and Saskatchewan Transportation Company, when they were up and going in our province, they were the big connectors to northern communities. Freight is what we haven't talked about because, you know, you just don't think about it. You think moving people. But freight is big with transportation companies. And now I'm really worried about who is going to take that freight. These are not big buses. These are small mini buses that are going to northern communities. They don't have a lot of room for freight. And I think that's an issue that the government actually, Dan, should look at because, yes, we need to get people to and from their communities, but I think freight is going to be the big problem that we're going to see, where you had these major buses come into communities that were capable of freight, and now these smaller buses certainly are not capable of freight. And of course, we've got to think about the safety. We just went through a horrific accident in Humboldt with the Broncos, and we want to know that these people that are taking over these new routes in Canada, in Western Canada, are capable of safety. I think that is the first thing that Minister Marc Garneau should look at, is make sure that when we are getting these new companies going, that they are in compliance with the safety of the highways in our provinces.
Ms. Jolibois, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Does this mean that the northern communities, especially Indigenous communities in the prairies, are going to be even more isolated?
Certainly. I want to clarify one point to Kevin's point, MP Waugh's point regarding urban First Nations and Métis population and Inuit population. In urban centers, in big cities across Canada from coast to coast to coast, has a huge population of Indigenous people who do live in the cities. And then yes, we do have population in the far north and in northern remote and the far north area. And we, as Canadians, just don't have same access to services and programs. Both Saskatchewan Party government have failed, continue to fail Northern Saskatchewan, continues to fail Indigenous people, and now the Liberal government. The Liberal government knew about this problem months ago, and yet they were slow on acting. And what they're saying is, in the meantime, to tell the Indigenous people, in the meantime, wait until we sort this out. How much longer are Indigenous people going to wait across Canada until the governments, both the Conservative or the Liberals, sort things out?
Okay, thank you for this. I'm sure it'll be a few years before we see the results of all this. We'll have a short break, but when we come back, the Auditor General came down hard on the programs that train Indigenous people for employment. Welcome back. The Auditor General, Michael Ferguson, came out with a report on the programs that train Indigenous people for jobs and came down hard on the Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Strategy. It was meant to help lower high unemployment rates and get Indigenous people better paying jobs. But Ferguson's report said the Department of Employment and Social Development did not track relevant data, so it had no idea if skills and training actually helped Indigenous people get jobs, or if they did, keep them.
But fundamentally, you know, if there is a program that is intended to try and help Indigenous people get sustainable and meaningful employment, and I think at this time the program was spending about $300 million a year, and I think we heard today that there will be another $100 million a year, so taking it up to $400 million a year, we would hope that we would be able to finally see a change in some of the outcomes. And
Mr. Wong, I'm going to start with you. Last week you weren't happy about how the Auditor General said there was a lack of data when it came to figuring out the socioeconomic gap, especially the graduation rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Yeah. So where does this lack of data on jobs and training rank for you?
Yeah, the same, very low, or not at all. I've known for years that we're not collecting data in our elementary and high schools. I've known for years that skills training is not where it should be in Indigenous communities. I know because as a school board trustee years ago, I could see it come through our system. And as a member of Parliament now, I'm talking to businesses and they're saying, we want to hire Northerners, and then all of a sudden you get them in the room and they find that their skill set isn't what they think it is. And this is an issue. I have a motion, and Dan was on the committee. We haven't gone to it yet in our committee, INAN committee, that wants to study a comprehensive review on education in this country for Indigenous peoples. I know the graduation rates are low. I know the skill set is very low. We're doing a study now on infrastructure in Northern Canada. We all know there's huge issues up in the north with infrastructure. The one is skills. The other one is retention. So they go hand in hand. I mean, company after company are coming with us right now saying the skill set is not what it should be. And the Auditor General, I mean, they should absolutely point their guns at what's happening right now. This will be a crisis in our country, no question about it. It is right now. It's going to be more so as we develop the north.
Mr. Vandel, I know jobs training isn't part of Indigenous services, but is it time to scrap Aboriginal skills and training and start a new program, start from scratch?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that our government and Minister Haidu accept the recommendations of the Auditor General, and Minister Haidu and the administration have been working with the Auditor General since the report was released last June, I believe. But more importantly is that we're working with Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations, we're partnering with Indigenous nations to put together a new framework for evaluation, which is going to include which indicators are there, what are the indicators that actually need to be measured. We're going to establish a baseline, what are those indicators, and we're going to make sure that in partnership with Indigenous nations that we do a better job. This, Todd, is more important than ever given the significant amounts of dollars that our government is going to be investing across the board in Indigenous nations, but specifically in employment and training. We've found we're investing $2 billion of new money over the next 5 years. So with those significant investments, evaluation and accountability becomes even more important than ever. But accountability to the nations and to the young people that deserve the services, deserve good services, and the communities that deserve to know how their young people are doing. So we need to be accountable to everybody, but especially the nations that we're serving.
But should you be investing that much money into a program that over 30 years we don't have results for? We don't know if it's working or not?
I believe we don't have a choice. In my community, in my city, Winnipeg, we're not a fast-growing city. The fastest-growing demographic are young Indigenous people, principally Métis and First Nation. We need to do a much better job not only finding new money to invest, but making sure that we do a better job administrating it, not only for society in general, but for the nations and the people that we're serving. We owe it to the people to do a better job of measurement and administration.
Ms. Jollybaugh, I personally have never heard of anybody who's gone through this and actually gotten a job. Have you? I mean, or is it really just time to start something new?
Before I answer your question, I want to clarify that when the Conservative government was in power under Stephen Harper, anything Indigenous population, anything Indigenous program services, Harper made so many cuts, and Indigenous population was not a priority for the Conservative. So hence the problems that we're having today. They had a chance to fix it and they didn't.
Well, this is
the
30
liberals,
years old.
The liberals, yes, thankfully that the awareness is there and the liberals are aware of it, and hopefully now the pressure will be on the liberals to fix the problem too. I do know that this tracking system doesn't just stop in the Aboriginal skills and training programs, it's straight across. The governments, previous, today and previous, have failed to track. That's what the Auditor General always repeatedly says. So it's really significant to understand that no wonder with systemic racism, systemic problems, that Indigenous people are having trouble across Canada. Having said that, though, there are still Indigenous people, young people, from city to city, coast to coast to coast, who are struggling, trying to make ends meet, who are doing a fine job in programs and services in cities across Canada.
Mr. Waugh, what would a Conservative government do with this report now you've heard it, if you're elected next year?
Yeah, it's not. That's an interesting question, Todd, because I think it's got to go back to the education system. The qualification for teachers on reserves in this province, in this country, that we haven't looked at. The data that's not supplied for children that are not going to school that say they are in school. This has got to be a complete overhaul. Todd, I think if our government, when we are government in 2019, that's our first mission, is to start talking about elementary and high school students, because I know they're not going to school, I know they're failing, I know they're being pushed through, and you know who pays for it? Everyone in society pays for it. That's the first step. How can you even talk about skills when you don't have the basic literacy? I talked on committee last week about grade 3 reading. If you can't read by grade 3, 90% of children will not make it in society. We haven't even addressed that. There is no tracking on literacy, as you heard in committee last week as we talked to the Auditor General. That's the first step, is grade 3. We got to get our kids reading at or above grade level in grade 3, and then they have a chance. So skills, it goes hand in hand. We have to have a complete audit. Where the money's going, what are we, there's no accountability in this. We've found this now. There is no accountability, there's no tracking. So if you have no tracking, how do you know how you're doing? So that's the first step that our government will make, is make sure that we set up a good education system for Indigenous people on reserves, which is the federal government's responsibility, not only in, in Saskatchewan and so on, but in northern areas. Because I just took a trip to Nunavut and had a great education. We got more teachers from Jamaica teaching in Nunavut than we have Canadians or Indigenous people.
This is not new. This is the creation of both the Conservative and the Liberal for generations in the past, historically, for decades. This has been a building up system, building up until now, and hence we have the problems that we have. So even know what the platform of conservative government, if they're in government and they're saying this is what we're going to do. But it fears me because what they will do is, they're going to say this, here are the problems, but we're going to make more cuts here.
We need
That's what
accountability.
they will do.
No, we need accountability.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to give Mr. Vandal the last word on this topic. Should we be putting more money, as being suggested, maybe into education rather than skills and training?
I think we need to put more money in all of the above, and that's exactly what we're doing. Since we've been elected in 2015, we've been cleaning up the mess created by Stephen Harper, 10 years of Stephen Harper, and Georgina is right. Under Harper, there was nothing but cuts. We've invested over $16 billion of new money in infrastructure, in health, in education, in child and family services. There's lots of work to do, and we owe it to the communities and the nations that we're working with to work with them, to partner with them to do a better job on accountability.
Well, interesting discussion. I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Welcome back. Before we leave for this week, Dakota LaLiberty is a young Métis paramedic from Île-à-la-Crosse, Saskatchewan, volunteers in his local Friendship Centre, and he was in Ottawa yesterday to appear before a committee of senators, where he told them that more mental health resources are needed for urban Indigenous youth.
And I see that both youth and adults in crisis are very, very common. I'm the person who responds to these calls. I'm the person's temporary solution to something much bigger than them. Like, I've seen the system firsthand shipping youth and adults down south because we lack the resources to help these individuals.
But if you come from a community in the north of 300 or 400 people into a very different culture in Ottawa or Toronto, I would imagine there are many issues that a young person would face.
I moved to Regina, Saskatchewan, which is our urban center, our capital.
Was it a big cultural change for you?
It definitely was. I don't know, I experienced a lot of racism and stuff, and that really sent me in a downward spiral, and I wasn't doing good in my classes because of it.
Is there somewhere, any kind of, within the system for that young person to go to, saying, I'm talking about this, I'm feeling like this, or messages that are out there in social media that are hints that are there? Is there any way that issue can be addressed before that act has taken place within the community that you're working in?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that they're contemplating suicide, but it could definitely lead up to that, and
Depression and
just having the feeling of loneliness in such a foreign place to someone. Like having services and programs for Indigenous youth to go to, like, I didn't have any of that. All I had was my Indigenous student services at Saskatchewan Polytechnic, and I went to hang out there. I didn't really tell people how I was feeling or anything. It felt like a home to me in a way. Mm-hmm. But definitely, it could definitely lead up to depression, because that's the way I felt sometimes.
That's it for this week, but if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.